The flourishing of art and culture, economic prosperity, isolation from the rest of the world, an incredibly strict social order, and above all, peace. That is what we usually think about when we hear the term Edo Period. Under the rule of the Tokugawa Shogunate from 1603 until 1868, Japan was allowed to rebuild and heal after centuries of near constant unrest, war, and infighting. And not only that, but in many ways, the Edo period was when Japan was able to truly develop its unique cultural identity that we all know and love today. Surely, the Edo period offered a welcome respite from the relentless conflict that preceded it. But while it is pretty easy to romanticize this era in Japanese history, it's also important to remember that peace and stability alone doesn't guarantee a utopia. Because beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic society lurked a different reality. Crime was actually a persistent fact of life in Edo period Japan, and a rigid social hierarchy, economic disparities, and the presence of a large population of unemployed and frustrated ex-samurai created a fertile breeding ground for criminal activities of all kinds. From petty theft to more serious crimes like illegal gambling, arson, and murder, the Edo period actually saw its fair share of lawlessness. So, in this video, I would like to take a look at a different, rarely talked about side of the Edo period, far away from kabuki shows and ukiyo-e woodblock printing, where crime, violence, and everything in between were a part of everyday life. What types of crime infested this seemingly peaceful period in Japanese history? Who committed these crimes? Who exactly was it that dealt with those who broke the law? And what kind of brutal punishment was enforced upon criminals in the Edo period? Today, we will tackle all of these questions, which might or might not include uncovering some pretty unsettling details in the process. If you end up enjoying this video, smash that beautiful like button and subscribe to my channel for even more Japanese crime and history content. Want to support me even further, starting at only $1 per month? Then feel free to visit the link below or in the description, which will take you to my Patreon page. But for now, we got a story to tell. This is the history of murder, crime, and prisons in Edo period Japan. Before we dive into crime in Edo Japan and how exactly it was punished by the authorities, let's talk a bit about who actually enforced these punishments, because back in the early 17th century, the concept of an actual police force was quite new for the Japanese. Prior to the 17th century and the Edo period, policing duties were usually in the hands of either the military or in some cases by regular citizens who chose to dedicate themselves to upholding social order. But that all changed with the start of the Edo period. For the first time in its history, Japan would implement a dedicated police apparatus to take care of criminal activities of all different kinds, ranging from misdeeds committed by government officials to crimes that were considered to be the most serious of them all, namely theft, arson, illegal gambling, and of course, murder. Large parts of Japan's first police force consisted of samurai who, with no wars left to fight during the Edo period, were probably pretty eager to work in the field of law enforcement, which in many ways gave them a chance to utilize their natural talents even in an age of relative peace. But all samurai are not created equal. And so, the role that a samurai took in Edo Japan's police force could vary greatly depending on his rank. Those of high rank with close ties to the ruling Tokugawa Shogunate received the title Machi Bugyo and served as the chief of police, prosecutor, and judge all rolled into one. A pretty damn influential position, befitting of a high-ranking samurai. Below the Machi Bugyo served the yoriki, or literally assistants, who were tasked with organizing and managing even lower-ranking police officials, like the doshin, basically patrol officers and prison guards who had actual contact with criminals while also investigating crimes. The doshin, despite being ranked below the yoriki and Machi Bugyo, were still part of the samurai class. But that actually wasn't the case for everyone who worked for Japan's Edo period police force. After all, strength in numbers is a deciding factor when trying to maintain peace throughout the nation, especially in the big cities like Edo or modern-day Tokyo, which consequently experienced the most police activity. Non-samurai members of the police came from all different kinds of backgrounds. The so-called komono, who accompanied the aforementioned doshin patrol officers and provided assistance during arrests and investigations, were basically regular townspeople, also known as chonin. Below even the regular townspeople, there were the social outcasts and criminals who had an incredibly grim outlook on life. And yet, they made up large parts of Japan's police force during the Edo period. Take for example the okapiki, basically criminal informers and spies who supplied the higher-ranking police officers with vital information related to criminal cases and investigations. They often chose to do so to avoid execution for their own crimes. Don't forget, this was a few centuries before the saying "snitches get stitches" was invented. In addition to the actual police force composed of samurai, townsmen, and criminals, there was also a group referred to as either goyokiki, meakashi, or tezaki. These groups, just like the aforementioned okapiki, often consisted of former criminals who started working as police assistants, the big difference being that they were directly hired by residents and merchants in certain neighborhoods, not by the police force. So, now that we've established who was in charge when it came to catching and punishing criminals, it is time to talk about the actual criminals themselves. What were their social backgrounds, and what crimes exactly did they commit? Well, as you can imagine, there is no short answer to this particular question. Obviously, everyone in Edo period Japan was at least capable of committing a crime, and the severity of the crimes committed could vary from fairly harmless violations of the countless strict rules that were part of everyday life during the Edo period, all the way to physical violence, theft, murder, or even serial murder. The latter in particular is a gruesome yet fascinating criminal topic to explore, especially because from time to time, brutal killing sprees that took place during this quote-unquote peaceful period in Japanese history were committed by the very same class that occupied the upper ranks of the police force, the samurai. One such case took place in 1663 in an area formerly known as Kokujo, now a part of modern-day Tokyo's Nihonbashi district. In the dead of night on a summer day of that year, numerous citizens of the area suddenly rushed to the local magistrate's house, all of them reporting something truly disturbing. An unknown person was roaming the area, randomly attacking everyone who dared cross his or her path. In total, 10 people were wounded that night, while another 8 victims were killed. Thankfully, the culprit's identity didn't remain a mystery for too long. At 8 AM the next morning, a monk appeared at the magistrate's office and reported the following. Quote, "Last night, a well-disposed ronin by the name of Magara Shingoro came to visit me at my house. Upon arrival, he asked, 'I have been holed up at Atagoyama where I have been offering prayers. However, I am very tired. Might I rest here for a while?' He looked like a fairly stable, trustworthy sort of fellow, so I let him in. Almost as soon as he had entered, he suddenly dropped down onto the floor and quickly fell into a deep sleep. This morning, when I went to take breakfast to Magara in his room where he was still asleep, I noticed that he had blood on various parts of his clothing. Not only that, the sword that he had drawn from its scabbard and placed upright on the floor was covered in blood, right up to the hilt. Being that he is a large man and unsure what he might do after he wakes up, I've hidden both his main and short swords as a precaution." Following the monk's confession, Shingoro was immediately arrested at his house without much resistance, and during his confession, he seemed to show not even a single ounce of regret regarding his actions. Quote, "Ordinarily, I pray at Atago Shrine. Last night while I was praying, I received a divine message which said, 'You should cut 1,000 people starting tonight. If you do this, all of your wishes shall come true.' So I left Atogayama and ran about cutting anybody I happened to come across. Just cutting and running. Cutting and running. I remember cutting around 20 or 30 people, but I have no idea whether they are still alive or dead." Not only is there a disturbing lack of regret in this statement, but Shingoro, reportedly with wide open eyes and gritted teeth, had the audacity to add the following request. "Please allow me to continue to cut 1,000 people. My wishes won't come true if I don't." The sad truth is that, while the case of Shingoro Magara was a standout incident because of the sheer number of people that he injured and even killed in such a short amount of time, crimes similar to his weren't all that uncommon, at least during the early Edo period. In fact, the Japanese even coined a term which refers to this exact kind of murder often committed by the samurai. Tsujigiri is not just the Japanese name of a dark type move called Night Slash introduced in Gen 4 of the Pokemon series. Literally translated as crossroad killing, Tsujigiri didn't always carry a purely negative connotation, because initially, Tsujigiri referred to a traditional, honorable duel between two warriors. It wasn't until the violent Sengoku, or Warring States period, which directly preceded the Edo period, that the term became synonymous with something else entirely. The killing of an innocent passersby done in order to test out the sharpness of a blade or the effectiveness of a new style of attack. This new, dishonorable version of Tsujigiri was most likely born out of something called kiriste gomen, literally the authorization to cut and leave, a law from the feudal era which permitted the samurai to kill someone of lower rank, usually commoners, who dared insult their honor. As insane as this law was, at least a samurai who utilized this authorization to cut and leave also had to prove his right to do so in court, as well as provide a witness. Because the misuse of kiriste gomen usually resulted in serious punishment, namely the beheading of the perpetrator as well as the abolishment of his entire house and family. As for Tsujigiri in the Edo period, the Tokugawa Shogunate was well aware of how much of a problem to public safety it was, and completely prohibited the practice in the early 17th century, also making it punishable by death. However, especially during the very early days of the Edo period, even a potential death sentence wasn't enough to dissuade some of the country's numerous, freshly unemployed samurai who couldn't quite get used to the lack of war and bloodshed from partaking in the act of crossroad killing. The aforementioned case of Shingoro Magara in 1663 is one example. But another very notable crime which could be put into the Tsujigiri category took place in 1696. The Yoshiwara killing spree, which saw a wealthy samurai lord by the name of Sano Chirosaemon losing his mind and consequently murdering a few dozen prostitutes in Yoshiwara, Edo's red light district. This incident was so brutal and so well known that multiple very successful kabuki plays about the murders found their way onto stages across Japan, usually accompanied by a highly fictionalized story that equipped the perpetrator with a sword forged by the supposedly cursed swordsmith Muramasa. But just like the samurai weren't the only ones who enforced the law during the Edo period, they also weren't the only ones who committed crimes. Obviously. When in 1806, a total of 13 residents of the city of Edo were stabbed with a spear over a span of 3 months, most of them disabled or poor, it appeared as if a serial killer with a clear pattern was on the loose. While 6 of the victims unfortunately passed away, 7 of them managed to flee and live to tell their story, leading to the killer's apprehension a month later. The culprit in this case was later revealed to have been not a samurai, but a former retainer within a samurai household who was curious to try his training with a spear on actual human beings. And after trying it once, he apparently became addicted to the thrill of it all, repeating his crime over and over. But shockingly, on the very same day that the original perpetrator was apprehended, attacks following the same exact pattern continued and kept on claiming the lives of poor and disabled people in the area for multiple months. These crimes were most likely committed by one or more copycat killers who, in some cases, used a carving knife instead of a spear to claim their victims. But unfortunately, no one in connection to these gruesome murders was ever caught, meaning that the motivations behind these serial killings and the identity of the perpetrators remained a mystery forever. Now, murder was obviously not the only type of crime that haunted Edo period Japan. I mean, the Tokugawa Shogunate knowingly enforced some pretty strict rules upon its population in an attempt to maintain peace and tranquility throughout the country. And so, with a strict social order firmly in place, committing a crime, even a small, insignificant one, was pretty damn easy, to be honest. And as the severity of the crime increased, so did the punishment. Things like theft, blackmail, and fraud, for example, usually came with an exile from the location where the crime was committed, often accompanied by a tattoo, also known as idesumi, on either the criminal's forehead or arms. These tattoos served more than one purpose. They didn't just immediately tell everyone that the marked person had once committed a crime. The pattern and location of the tattoo on the perpetrator's body could also identify where exactly the crime was committed, which made enforcing said exile a lot easier for the authorities. Among the most serious crimes of the Edo period, which were by the way reported to the shogunate directly, were illegal gambling, arson, and of course manslaughter. These crimes were punishable by death, and in order to carry out the harshest of all punishments as efficiently as possible, Japan's capital city of Edo, or current-day Tokyo, was home to countless prisons and execution grounds. 3 of these execution grounds in particular gained notoriety for witnessing the demise of hundreds of thousands of criminals, which was often achieved in an incredibly gruesome manner. All 3 of these execution grounds were strategically placed on the outskirts of the city of Edo. Here, and here, to be exact. These remote locations did not only allow for the horror of executions taking place there to be kept as far away as possible from the glitz and glamour of the city center, they also served a second, very important purpose by sending a clear message to everyone who passed by one of these grounds while entering the city of Edo, basically saying, do not mess with the shogunate and its rules, or this is where you will end up. One of these execution grounds, known as Denmacho Prison, was in use from 1613 all the way to 1875, and is estimated to have witnessed the deaths of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 criminals during its active period. Denmacho Prison was used mainly for high-profile executions involving criminals of samurai status, which also means that this was the nicest of Edo's 3 big execution grounds. Allegedly though, the awfulness of your stay here was more or less decided by how rich you were. But no matter how much cash you had to your name, a visit to Denmacho was far from a relaxing way to spend your final days, weeks, months, or even years. Proper ventilation during Edo's scorchingly hot summer days was basically non-existent. The toilet was located right in the middle of the prison grounds, diseases spread like wildfire, and no attempt was made to hide from the prisoners the many executions which took place pretty much non-stop, all day long for everyone to see, and hear, and smell. Corpses were usually left out in the open to rot for several days following an execution, which in most cases involved the beheading of the criminal. The actual task of executing inmates at Denmacho was in most cases completed by Yamada Asaemon, the main executioner who carried a title and occupation passed down from generation to generation inside the Yamada family. The Asaemons were also the shogunate's very own sword testers, often conducting tests on actual living human bodies, because reasons. Now, while Denmacho actually included a commoners section as well, most inmates were pretty famous or high-ranking. Take for example Takano Joe, a famous scholar and samurai doctor who, 5 years into serving a life sentence at Denmacho for insulting the Tokugawa Shogunate, started a fire inside the prison and actually managed to escape. Overall, as grim as this place was, Denmacho was pretty much the place to be if you were sentenced to death in Edo back in the day. But if you ended up at one of the following 2 execution grounds, well, good luck, because these 2 places were probably as close to living hell as you were going to get back then. Let's start off by taking a look at Tsujigiri, located along the Tokaido, one of the most important routes of Edo period Japan. This execution ground was also placed pretty much right next to the entrance to the city of Edo, serving, as explained before, as a chilling warning to those who entered the capital. Helped by an open display of decapitated heads as shown in this photo, which I had to blur out for obvious reasons. But I guess you can imagine where the heads are and what they looked like. What set Tsujigiri apart from Denmacho especially was the range of execution methods used here. Beheading was the most efficient and popular method here as well. But boiling and burning criminals alive, and even crucifixion, were also a big part of this prison's gruesome catalog of execution techniques. Which technique was ultimately used to end a criminal's life depended mostly on the crime that they had committed. Take for example the case of Yaoya Oshichi, a woman who fell in love with a man she met during a fire at his family's temple. In hopes of meeting him again by causing another fire, she committed arson in the capital city of Edo, was caught and arrested, and ultimately burned at the stake in Tsujigiri. Tsujigiri prison was also home to Namidabashi, the Bridge of Tears, which marked the place where inmates would leave the detention center to enter the execution grounds, and the last place where they would be able to speak to their families before meeting their demise. That's actually pretty depressing. Last, but certainly not least, we have Kosukabara in operation from 1651 until 1873 and, much like Demajo prison, witness to an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 executions. Kosukabara is also said to have been the messiest execution ground in all of Edo. Yes, even compared to the hygienic horrors of Demajo described a few minutes ago. Cremating dead bodies was not a thing here. They were instead dumped into mass graves, which weren't only incredibly unsanitary, but also allowed wild animals to drag bones all over the place. Even to this day, locals choose to call the street where Kosukabara was once located Kotsudori, or Bone Street, for this exact reason. Actually, that whole area is still considered to be a somewhat eerie, haunted, and generally not very desirable place to live. Which allegedly makes this a pretty cheap area in terms of rent, so if you're short on money but thought about moving to Tokyo, Bone Street and its surrounding area might actually be a pretty good option for you. The same apparently goes for the area surrounding Susugamori, by the way. But moving away from affordable real estate and back to history, in 1741, the Kubikiri Chizo, or Decapitation Buddha, was built on the grounds of Kosukabara, and it does pretty much exactly what its name implies. Executions at Kosukabara took place in front of the eyes of this Buddha statue, which actually still exists to this day, meaning that for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of convicted criminals, this very statue was the last thing that they ever laid their eyes on. Oh, and there is now a temple which stands on the former graveyard of Kosukabara, which also rocks a huge Tokugawa clan emblem above its entrance. Make of that what you will. When the Edo period finally came to an end in 1868, the structure of Japan's police force and the methods used for punishing criminals both obviously had to undergo major changes in order to comply with Emperor Meiji's effort of revolutionizing and in many ways westernizing the land of the rising sun. Only a few years after the emperor took control of the country in 1868, Tokyo's execution grounds had stopped operating, or at least officially. Denmajo, for example, was reportedly used by the Meiji government for another 8 years in order to renegotiate some treaties between them and the shogunate, but change was afoot nonetheless. The death, no pun intended, of archaic execution methods like beheadings, burning at the stake, etc. was accompanied by a new, European-style police force first introduced in 1874 with the help of statesman Kawachi Toshiyoshi. This new police force didn't just match the ambitions of the emperor, but it also ended up serving as the foundation for Japanese law enforcement as we know it today. Crime in Japan, on the other hand, obviously continued to exist and even thrive after Japan had entered into a new, exciting, and sometimes problematic era. Organized crime syndicates, with origins going back as far as those of the police itself, really started gaining a foothold in Japan, but also went through many ups and downs as the 20th century progressed. Despite that, the country's criminal landscape is now a far cry from what it once was. Japan is nowadays considered to be one of the safest and most peaceful countries in the entire world. Maybe not as much as some statistics would imply, but still incredibly safe nonetheless. Whether that peace was achieved due to the presence of a well-organized police force, the peace-loving nature of the Japanese population itself, or maybe a mix of both, well, that is up for debate. But despite Japan still handing out the death penalty by hanging for the gravest of crimes, at the very least you certainly won't have to live in fear of becoming a victim of Tsujigiri in Japan these days. What other parts of Japanese history would you like to see me cover in a future video? Let me know in the comments down below. As usual, a shout out goes to all my Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, Bobby Wu, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, RK0, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Tori and Gales, Cats and Soup, and Thore. And to everyone who watched all the way until the end, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.